If you're listening before sleep, you are in the right place. Some stories are meant to frighten. Others are meant to follow you quietly into the dark, the way certain memories do, slowly, patiently, without raising their voice. This story belongs to the second kind. Because some places do not simply exist in isolation. They remember. They record. They connect. And sometimes, they reveal something that has been moving between them for a very long time. You already know 3 of those places. The house that remembered me. The abandoned asylum that recorded my presence. And the sanatorium built in 1926 in the forests of Karelia, the place that revealed how those locations were connected. But the system did not end there. In fact, the sanatorium had shown me something else entirely. A 4th point. Not clearly. Not fully. Just a brief reflection of a corridor that did not belong to any of the buildings I had visited. Older stone. Darker walls. And something that had moved slowly across the distant hallway. After returning home from Karelia, I spent several days trying to convince myself that what I had seen inside the circular room of the sanatorium had simply been another distortion of its strange architecture. The building had already demonstrated its ability to alter distance. To reveal reflections that did not belong to the present moment. To show places that existed far beyond the river outside its walls. Perhaps the final panel had been nothing more than another coordinate, another location within the system. But the photograph on the table told a different story. The small figure on the distant shoreline had not disappeared. Every evening when the house grew quiet, I found myself returning to the sitting room to look at the image again. The sanatorium stood beside the river exactly as it had before. The narrow path along the opposite bank remained visible. And the dark figure still stood there, unmoving. Facing the water. Facing the building. Facing the place where I had stood earlier that day. At first I believed the image had simply changed because of the lighting in the room. But on the 4th night I noticed something else. The figure was slightly closer to the water. Not much. Just enough to change the angle of its reflection in the river. That was when I understood. The photograph was not a photograph anymore. It was part of the system. Something within the network of places had begun to move. The house seemed to understand this before I did. Late that same evening, as the wind moved quietly through the trees outside, the familiar creak of the upstairs floorboards began again. But this time the sound was different. Not the slow adjustment of wood beneath cooling air. Not the soft shift of structure settling into the night. It sounded like footsteps. Measured. Even. Crossing the hallway above my bedroom. I stood in the sitting room listening carefully. The house did not feel alarmed. It felt attentive. The way it had felt the night I first returned. As though the building itself were observing something that had just entered its awareness. The footsteps upstairs stopped. For several seconds the house returned to complete silence. Then, somewhere inside the walls, a faint shifting sound traveled slowly downward, not through the staircase, but through the structure itself. A quiet ripple moving through wood and plaster. The same kind of structural adjustment I had felt inside the asylum corridors. Inside the sanatorium. The system was aligning again. I looked back at the photograph. The figure beside the river had moved once more. This time it stood directly at the edge of the water. For a long moment I simply watched the image. Nothing else changed. The sanatorium remained still. The river remained dark and smooth beneath the sky. But the figure's reflection had become clearer. And something about the shape of that reflection felt wrong. Not distorted. Not blurred. Just incomplete. As though the water could only reflect part of what was standing there. That was when I noticed the envelope again. I had left it on the table beside the photograph several days earlier, assuming it contained nothing more than the single message I had already read. But now there was another piece of paper inside. Folded once. The handwriting on this page was the same careful script as before. And beneath the words was a date. Hydrological Station No. 12 Lake Vyra, built 1894. Below that, only one sentence had been written. The system did not begin with the house. I read the line several times before looking back toward the photograph. The figure beside the river had not moved again. But the reflection in the water seemed slightly darker now. As though the surface of the river had deepened. As though the distance between places had shifted again. The hydrological station stood somewhere far north of the sanatorium, beyond the forests that bordered the Karelian rivers. A structure older than any building I had yet seen within the system. Older even than the asylum. If the house remembered people, if the asylum recorded them, and if the sanatorium connected the distance between places, then the station built in 1894 must have served another purpose entirely. Perhaps the first purpose. The one that had allowed everything else to exist. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again, brushing the side of the house with a long, slow sound. Upstairs, the hallway remained quiet. But the house no longer felt like the beginning of the story. It felt like a place that had only recently been added to something much older. And somewhere beyond the forests and rivers of the north, the system had already begun revealing the place where it started. The decision to travel north again came more easily this time. Not because the journey would be shorter. Not because the destination felt safer. But because the system had already begun moving. And when something inside that network shifted, the places connected to it seemed to notice. The house certainly did. That night the footsteps upstairs returned only once more. They crossed the hallway slowly, paused near the staircase, and then faded into the quiet structure of the building without descending. It was not the restless pacing of someone exploring unfamiliar rooms. It sounded more like inspection. As if whatever had moved through the system had briefly visited the house and found nothing it needed. By morning the air inside the rooms had settled again. The photograph on the table remained unchanged. The figure still stood beside the water. But the envelope now contained directions. Not written like instructions. Just a sequence of locations. Old road numbers. Forest routes. A small village name I recognized from a map of northern Karelia. And at the bottom of the page, one final line. The station measures distance differently. That sentence stayed with me throughout the drive. The road north from the house had already become familiar during my visit to the sanatorium. But this time the journey continued far beyond the point where I had turned toward the river weeks earlier. The forests grew denser. The towns grew smaller. By late afternoon the paved highway narrowed into a long rural road that followed the edge of a vast lake. Lake Vyra. The water stretched so far across the horizon that it resembled a quiet grey sea more than an inland lake. Small waves moved slowly along the shoreline, carrying the faint sound of wind across the open surface. The hydrological station stood at the far end of a narrow wooden pier extending into the lake. At first I almost drove past it. The building was much smaller than I had imagined. A single narrow structure raised on thick wooden supports above the water. Its walls were made of dark timber that had weathered into a deep grey color over the decades. A metal gauge tower rose beside it, thin and skeletal against the pale sky. And beneath the eaves of the roof, barely visible through the age-darkened wood, a small carved marking remained. 1894. The station had not been abandoned in the same way the asylum had. It had simply stopped being visited. The wooden pier creaked quietly as I walked toward the building. The boards were old but stable, worn smooth by years of weather rather than neglect. The lake moved slowly beneath the structure, the water dark and reflective under the gathering evening clouds. For several moments I stood at the edge of the platform and looked back toward the shoreline. The forest remained still. No other buildings were visible. No roads. No signs that anyone had traveled here recently. It felt very different from the sanatorium. The sanatorium had been a junction, a place that revealed connections between other locations. But the station felt like something else entirely. It felt like a starting point. The door opened with only a slight resistance. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. A narrow desk stood beside the wall. Several long measuring rods hung from iron hooks near the window that faced the open lake. Old water level charts had been nailed to the boards above the desk, their paper faded but still legible. Numbers. Dates. Lines marking the rise and fall of the lake over decades. But something about the chart seemed unusual. The measurements did not follow regular intervals. Some marks were days apart. Others were separated by months. And then, suddenly, there were gaps of several years where nothing had been recorded at all. I stepped closer to the largest chart. The earliest line began in 1894. The graph moved steadily upward and downward across the page as the seasons changed. Spring floods. Summer droughts. Winter ice. But halfway across the sheet the measurements changed. The intervals between markings grew uneven. And then something strange appeared beside one of the later dates. Not a number. Not a measurement. Just a small hand-drawn symbol beside the line. A narrow vertical mark. Almost like a doorway. I studied the chart more carefully. The same symbol appeared again several years later. And again. Each time the mark appeared, the measurement lines on the graph shifted abruptly, as though the water level had changed too quickly to record gradually. The station did not simply measure the lake. It measured events. Events that occurred when something within the system passed through this place. The window beside the desk looked directly out across the water. For a moment the surface of the lake appeared perfectly still. Then a long ripple crossed the reflection, traveling slowly toward the pier. Not caused by wind. Not by a passing boat. Just a narrow disturbance moving across the dark surface. And for the briefest moment, the reflection in the water beneath the station did not match the sky above it. Instead of clouds, the surface showed something else. A long corridor of stone. The same corridor I had seen inside the final panel of the sanatorium. Older walls. Rougher stone. And somewhere far down that hallway, a slow shadow moved from one side to the other. The ripple passed beneath the pier. The reflection vanished. The water returned to the pale grey surface of the evening sky. Inside the station, the wooden structure creaked softly as the lake moved beneath it. The charts on the wall remained still. But now I understood what the message in the envelope had meant. The station did not measure water levels. It measured when the system moved. And the ripple on the lake had just marked another crossing. The ripple disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. Within seconds the lake returned to its slow, steady surface, reflecting the grey sky above the station as though nothing had disturbed it at all. But the charts on the wall behind me suddenly felt different. Not mysterious. Not symbolic. Accurate. Each uneven mark on those pages had recorded something similar to the ripple I had just seen, a moment when the system shifted, when whatever moved between the places crossed one of its hidden distances. The station had been measuring those crossings since 1894. I stepped back from the window and studied the interior of the room more carefully. The structure was simple. The desk. The charts. The rods used to measure the height of the water. But near the far corner of the room I noticed something that had not immediately drawn my attention when I entered. A narrow wooden ladder built directly into the wall. It led upward through a square opening in the ceiling toward the small observation tower I had seen from outside. The wood of the ladder was darker than the surrounding boards. More worn. Used more frequently. I placed my hand on the first rung. The station shifted slightly beneath my weight, not dramatically, just enough to remind me that the entire building stood above open water. For a moment the lake beneath the floorboards moved with a quiet, hollow sound. Then the structure settled again. I climbed slowly. Each rung creaked softly as the wood adjusted beneath my hands, but the sound remained contained within the ladder shaft, the way sound had been contained within the corridors of the asylum. The tower above was smaller than I expected. A narrow circular space surrounded by tall windows looking out across the lake in every direction. The view was immense. The shoreline stretched far beyond the reach of the pier, the dark forests forming a continuous line along the horizon. From this height the station felt isolated in a way that the other buildings never had. The house had stood among trees. The asylum had been surrounded by long abandoned roads. The sanatorium had faced a river and forest. But this station stood alone on open water. And that solitude felt deliberate. I stepped toward the window facing north. The lake beneath the tower reflected the dim light of the evening sky, the long waves moving slowly across the surface. Then something changed. Not in the water. In the distance. The horizon line seemed to shift. At first I assumed it was simply the fading light playing with the surface of the lake. But as I watched more carefully, I realized the distortion was happening somewhere else. Far across the water, the line of the forest appeared to bend slightly inward. Not dramatically. Just enough to create the impression that the distance between the station and the shoreline had changed. The same sensation I had felt at the sanatorium returned. Space was adjusting. The station was aligning with something. I looked down toward the pier below. The ripple I had seen earlier had disappeared completely. But the reflection beneath the station looked darker now, not because of the sky, but because the water seemed to carry a depth that had not been visible before. Then I noticed the shadow. At first it looked like nothing more than a darker patch beneath the surface. But it was too long. Too narrow. And it moved against the direction of the wind. The shape passed slowly beneath the platform supporting the station. Not quickly. Not suddenly. Just a steady, deliberate movement through the water. And as it crossed beneath the tower, the wood beneath my feet gave a faint, hollow sound. The same kind of sound a floorboard makes when someone steps on it from below. I remained perfectly still. The shadow continued moving. It did not rise toward the surface. It did not disturb the water. But it remained visible for several seconds as it passed beyond the pier and disappeared into the darker part of the lake. Only then did the air inside the tower shift. Not with wind. With pressure. The kind of quiet adjustment I had felt inside the sanatorium when the system revealed its reflections. The station was not simply recording crossings. It was close enough to observe them. I turned slowly toward the ladder. The room below remained silent. The chart still hung on the wall. The water beneath the station moved quietly against the supports. But something about the building felt slightly different now. The structure was no longer waiting for the next crossing. It had just witnessed one. And somewhere far beyond the lake, beyond the forests and the distant buildings that formed the network, something within the system had just passed closer to the surface than it ever had before. For the first time since discovering the house that remembered me, the system no longer felt like a quiet architecture of places. It felt like a path. And whatever followed that path had just passed beneath the station built in 1894. I remained in the tower for several minutes after the shadow disappeared beneath the lake. Nothing else disturbed the surface of the water. The long grey waves moved slowly across the open distance, carrying the quiet sound of wind toward the wooden supports beneath the station. From this height, the lake looked calm. But the hollow sound beneath the floorboards had changed something in the atmosphere of the building. The station no longer felt like a place that simply recorded events. It felt like a place that had just confirmed one. I climbed back down the ladder slowly. Each rung creaked softly beneath my weight, the wood answering with the quiet patience of something that had endured more than a century of weather and movement. When I stepped into the main room again, the air felt slightly warmer. Not from heat. From alignment. The charts on the wall now made more sense than they had earlier. The uneven gaps between measurements. The strange symbols beside certain dates. Each one had marked a moment when the system shifted. When something crossed between the places connected by that invisible structure. But one detail still puzzled me. The charts recorded those events for decades. Yet the station had never been expanded, never reinforced, never replaced. For a building designed to observe something so rare and unpredictable, its construction was almost modest. A small wooden structure standing quietly above open water. I walked toward the largest chart again. The earliest markings from 1894 filled the left side of the page with neat, regular measurements. But farther along the graph the symbols began appearing more frequently. And then, near the center of the sheet, the symbols changed. The narrow vertical marks, the ones that resembled small doorways, suddenly stopped. In their place appeared a different sign. A thin horizontal line crossing the measurement scale. Just once. Dated 1931. The same year the asylum had been built. I studied the mark carefully. Unlike the other symbols, this one had been drawn with heavier ink. Deliberate. Important. It had not recorded a crossing. It had recorded a construction. The asylum had not simply joined the system. It had altered it. The station had continued its measurements after that date, but the intervals between the symbols had grown longer again. As though the addition of the asylum had stabilized something that once moved more freely. I stepped back from the chart and looked toward the window again. The lake outside remained calm. But the memory of the shadow beneath the tower lingered in my mind. The system had not been completely stabilized. It had only slowed whatever moved through it. A faint sound came from outside. Not from the water. From the pier. A soft wooden creak. The same sound the boards had made when I first walked toward the station. For several seconds I stood still and listened. The sound came again. One board. Then another. Not random. Measured. Someone, or something, was moving along the pier. The station did not feel alarmed. The way the house had once felt attentive when footsteps crossed its hallway. The building simply held its structure in quiet stillness. As if it had expected this moment eventually. I moved toward the door slowly. The pier stretched away from the station toward the distant shoreline, the boards pale beneath the dim evening light. No figure stood on the wood. No movement disturbed the long surface of the lake. But halfway along the pier, one of the boards shifted slightly downward. Just enough to suggest that something heavy had stepped on it. Then the pressure lifted. Another board farther along the path bent slightly in the same way. Whatever had passed beneath the station had not remained in the water. It had simply continued moving along the path of the system. And for a brief moment, it had crossed the station itself. I watched the pier until the board stopped moving. The forest along the distant shore remained silent. The lake returned to its quiet rhythm beneath the wind. But the air around the station had changed again. The building had not just measured the crossing. It had felt it. And now the chart on the wall behind me held another empty space where the next symbol would eventually appear. Because somewhere beyond the forests, beyond the sanatorium and the asylum and the house that remembered me, the path of the system continued. And something that had followed that path for a very long time had just stepped briefly onto the station built in 1894. The pier became still again. The boards returned to their quiet position above the water, the faint tension in the wood settling back into the structure of the station. For several seconds I remained standing in the doorway, watching the length of the narrow path stretching toward the distant shoreline. Nothing moved. The forest remained silent. The lake carried the slow grey reflection of the evening sky. But the memory of those shifting boards remained clear in my mind. Something had crossed the station. Not quickly. Not violently. Just the same calm, deliberate movement I had seen in the reflection of the stone corridor inside the sanatorium. Whatever followed the path of the system did not rush. It traveled with patience. I stepped back inside the station and closed the door. The room returned to its quiet stillness. But the charts on the wall felt different now. Until this moment, they had recorded events that had already happened. Now one of those events had just taken place. I approached the largest chart again. The space beside the most recent date remained empty. No symbol had appeared. No mark had been added. Yet the station had clearly felt the crossing. Perhaps the charts were not updated immediately. Perhaps the system recorded its movements in ways the station simply observed. My eyes moved across the earlier entries again. The narrow vertical marks. The long gaps between them. The single heavy line beside 1931. Then something else caught my attention. Near the far right edge of the paper, where the most recent measurements had been recorded, another symbol had been drawn. It was faint. Almost unfinished. But it had not been there earlier. A small circle. Not a doorway. Not a line. Just a thin ring beside the most recent measurement. I leaned closer. The ink was darker than the surrounding markings. Fresh. Someone had drawn it recently. Or something had. The station did not feel abandoned anymore. It felt maintained. Not by caretakers. By the system itself. I stepped away from the chart slowly. The air in the room remained calm. But somewhere beneath the quiet structure of the station, the water of the lake shifted gently against the wooden supports. The ripple from earlier had passed. The shadow beneath the surface had moved on. But the station had recorded its presence in another way. Not with a measurement. With a symbol. A circle. I climbed the ladder to the tower again. Outside, the sky had grown darker, the last pale light of evening stretching across the open water. From this height the lake looked endless. The pier extended toward the shore like a narrow thread connecting the station to the land beyond. For a moment I wondered whether the moving boards had truly been caused by something walking across them. Or whether the station itself had simply adjusted beneath the passing of something that no longer needed physical paths. The system did not seem limited to ordinary movement. The reflections in the sanatorium had shown places separated by vast distances. The ripple beneath the station had shown a corridor beneath the surface of the lake. And now the chart had drawn a symbol that had not been recorded before. A circle. I looked across the darkening horizon. Somewhere beyond the forest stood the sanatorium. Beyond that, the asylum. And farther south, the house that had first remembered me. Each of those places had served a role. Memory. Archive. Connection. But the circle on the chart suggested something else. Completion. Or return. The system was not only tracking where something moved. It was beginning to show where it was going. And standing alone in the narrow tower above the lake built in 1894, I realized something I had not considered before. Perhaps the system had never been designed to contain what moved through it. Perhaps it had been built to follow it. To measure its path. And now, for the first time in more than a century, the path had drawn a circle. The tower grew darker as the last light of evening faded across the lake. For several minutes I remained beside the window, watching the slow movement of water beneath the pier and the quiet horizon beyond the forests. Nothing else appeared on the surface. The shadow beneath the lake had passed. The boards of the pier had settled again. But the symbol on the chart downstairs had changed something in the atmosphere of the station. A circle. Not a measurement. Not a doorway. A return. I climbed down the ladder slowly and stepped back into the main room of the station. The air felt cooler now, the way wooden buildings do when the night begins settling around them. The charts remained on the wall exactly as before. Except for the newest mark. The small circle near the edge of the graph. For several seconds I studied it again. Then I noticed something I had missed earlier. The circle was not completely closed. A tiny gap remained at the bottom of the ring. So small that it would have been easy to overlook. The mark had not been finished. I stepped closer to the chart, looking at the gap in the ink. The line had stopped just before meeting itself. As though whoever, or whatever, had drawn it intended to close the circle later. But not yet. The station had not recorded the end of a path. Only the beginning of its return. Outside, the lake moved gently against the supports of the building again. The hollow sound beneath the floorboards echoed softly through the room, the same sound I had heard earlier when the shadow passed below the tower. But this time the water seemed calmer. Almost patient. The station had done its work. It had observed the crossing. It had marked the change. And now the system would continue adjusting around it. I stepped outside onto the pier. Night had settled fully across Lake Vyra. The water had turned almost black, reflecting only the faint outline of clouds drifting slowly above. The forest along the shore had disappeared into shadow. But the air carried a quiet clarity that had not been present earlier in the evening. The crossing had finished. Whatever had passed through the system had continued along its path. And somewhere beyond the dark water and the forests and the distant buildings that formed the network, the movement was still unfolding. I walked halfway along the pier and stopped. The boards beneath my feet no longer shifted. The lake remained still. But something about the darkness across the water felt different. Not threatening. Not alive. Just aware. As if the lake itself had become part of the system's observation. For a moment I thought I saw a faint disturbance far out on the surface. A ripple. Very small. Then it faded into the slow motion of the waves. I returned to the station once more before leaving. Inside, the chart on the wall remained unchanged. The small circle still waited unfinished beside the most recent measurement. The gap at the bottom of the ring remained open. The system had not closed the path. Because the movement had not reached its destination yet. I turned off the small lantern on the desk and stepped outside again. The station faded slowly into darkness behind me as I walked along the pier toward the distant shore. By the time I reached the forest road, the lake had become almost invisible in the night. Only the faint outline of the tower remained against the sky. Hours later, when I returned home, the house greeted me with the same quiet stillness as before. The floorboards did not shift. The walls did not adjust. But the photograph on the table had changed again. The sanatorium beside the river remained the same. The distant shoreline was still visible. But the figure that had once stood beside the water was no longer there. Instead, something else appeared in the reflection of the river. A faint circle in the surface of the water. Not complete. Just a thin ring that stopped before closing. The same unfinished symbol that had appeared on the chart in the station. For several seconds I looked at the photograph without moving. Then I understood. The system was not marking where the movement had been. It was marking where it would return. And somewhere within the network of places that should not remember, the circle was slowly beginning to close. To be continued.